And the whole point of this year is that every story points to Jesus. And we've been laying that out each week because, and I feel it's important to remind you why that's important. It's because if all we learn is a good moral lesson from the Bible, if all we learn is a good moral lesson that can be followed with or without Jesus, we have misused His Word. Jesus Himself, on the road, after He was resurrected, He's walking with this couple on the road to Emmaus. You may remember this story. And Jesus Himself opens up the Old Testament to them and shows them how everything relates to Him. Jesus Himself looked at the Pharisees and said, you study the Word and you look at it and you think that by it you find eternal life, but you're missing me. So Jesus Himself is saying, I am the point. And so it's important. So here's today's story in a nutshell. We'll just kind of, spoiler alert it and just lay it all out there beforehand because I think probably everybody in this room already knows the story anyway. But let me just remind you what the story is. The story is that God, after a time, tests Abraham. And God tests Abraham by saying to him, I want you to sacrifice your son. I want you to offer him as a burnt offering on a mountain that I'll tell you about. And incredibly, Abraham goes. They get together all the stuff that's needed for a sacrifice, the wood, the knife, the fire. They go on this 3-day journey, and there it gets to the point where Isaac is actually bound, and he's laid on the altar. He's on the wood, and Abraham is about to offer him his sacrifice when an angel stops him and says, no, don't do that. And then he is shown a ram. And so he sacrifices the ram instead. Now that's the short version, and we'll get into it. We'll read it all. But that's the short version. And so here's the question I have, though, immediately, is just be honest. What is your initial response to a story in which God says to Abraham, I want you to sacrifice your son? What is your instant response?
That's crazy.
That's crazy. One of you, and I won't tell who, but one of you actually came to me last week and said, I'm really interested to see what you're going to do with this story because I'm amazed it's even in the Jesus Storybook Bible. She says, I'm going to do my best to, talk to my kids about this and not induce nightmares. Because this is an awful story. This is hard to stomach. Why would God test Abraham in such a terrible way? This is unthinkable. I mean, it's not just crazy. This is just like, why does this story even exist? That's my question. So, that's that part. And then there's the part that, Charlie has talked to about already. And it's the part that is, just put it this way. Getting to Jesus in this story is easy. You could tell this story to someone who doesn't know much of the Bible, and they would be able to go, oh, well, that's Jesus. It's obvious. You've got a father that was willing to sacrifice his son. You've got a son that carried the wood to an appointed place of sacrifice. You have a son that willingly laid down his life and prepared to die. The only difference is that in this case, with Abraham and Isaac, the sacrifice is stopped, and there's a ram that's substituted. But that, of course, points forward all that much more clearly to Jesus. So that's easy. Getting to Jesus from this story is really easy. It's the story itself that makes us go, ugh. It's the story itself that makes us cringe. The idea of Abraham being willing to sacrifice his son is tough. And it is so unthinkable that typically we really want to hurry to get to Jesus. To do that, we typically soften this story. We explain it, we excuse it, we justify it, and we move right past the discomfort and straight to, but Jesus died. And I don't want us to do that this morning. God didn't stop the sacrifice when it came to His own Son. Jesus did die as a substitute in my place, etc., etc., etc. And now I cling to the old rugged cross and its amazing grace in which I stand. And, but I don't want us to just leap there. Okay? Let's back up. As uncomfortable as it is, as many questions we have that we can't answer, let's back up. This is one of the richest, most emotional texts in the Bible. If you've read the Bible, you know that it is not written like a novel. We are often just kind of filling in the emotional gaps. We're trying to figure out, okay, what did Noah feel when he was building the ark? Was he ever frustrated? Probably. Did he ever whack himself with a hammer? Probably. Was he ever angry at something about all this whole process? Probably. But we don't know, because it's not in there. Was he sad when it began to rain and people are drowned? Of course he was, but it's not in there. But listen to how this story is written. This is chapter 22 of Genesis. Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And Abraham said, here I am. And God said, take now your son, your only son, the one you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I will tell you. Now, lest we be unclear what that means kill him and burn him as a sacrifice, without getting too graphic. But it sets it up with your son, your only son, the one you love. And then he names him Isaac, son of laughter. Yeah, I don't think Abraham is laughing at this point. By the time you get to this part of offer him there as a burnt offering, it is a gut punch. I mean, we know the story. We know Isaac lives. We know that later God forbids human sacrifice, lest anyone even think that they heard God say something that crazy. We might even know that later God declares that the firstborns belong to him and that sacrifice would be necessary to redeem them. But all Abraham knows is that after decades, think of everything it took to get to this point of having Isaac in the first place. After decades, God gave him this promised son and entered into covenant promise with him and his descendants. Abraham knows that other cultures around him have engaged in human sacrifice. Abraham knows that this is Isaac. His Isaac. His only true son. He knows that this is the one that he loves. And so after this tender description, offer him as a burnt offering, just took his breath out. You know it had to. Also note there's no rewards listed for Abraham's obedience. There's no assurances. There's nothing in there that says that if you do this, this will happen. It's just, there's black and white. Take your son, your only son, the one you love, Isaac, and sacrifice him. How could God do this? It doesn't make sense. But all the text says is that God was testing Abraham. So what follows is one of the most incredible sentences in all the Bible. I got to thinking about this and looking at this and reading this and thinking, this is so crazy that if you didn't grow up in church, if you're just kind of checking out the Jesus thing, if you tell this story to somebody that doesn't really know the church story and doesn't really know Jesus and doesn't really think about these things all that often, if you were to tell this story to that person, they would think, oh my goodness, the fact that you believe this, number one, actually happened, and number two, that you hold this as some sort of example of your faith, what are you, nuts? This is so crazy. But here's what happens. So Abraham rose early in the morning. Have you ever had the worst day of your life coming up? And you just stayed in bed a little bit longer because maybe, just maybe, it'll go away? Right? You know, I see some nods. I've done that. This says Abraham got up early. So let's get an early start on the worst day of my life. He saddled his donkey, he took two of his two young men with him, and Isaac his son. He split wood for the burnt offering. So let's do back-breaking hard work in order to prepare for the worst day of my life. He arose and went to the place at which God had told him. On the third day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. So he had 3 days to think about this. He had 3 days to hide this secret, to hold this secret inside of him. He had 2 nights to stare into a campfire and tell stories and laugh and pretend like everything was normal. He also had 2 nights to look up at the stars and think, oh, God, you said that my descendants would be like that. What are you doing? He had 2 nights, 3 days to rehearse God's covenant and to be reminded of God's promises. Verse 5, Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over there, and we will worship and return to you." And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife, so the 2 of them walked on together. You could picture it, can't you? This is so amazingly different than every other story in the Bible. Isaac spoke to Abraham and his father and said, "My father?" And Abraham said, "Here I am, my son." And Isaac said, "Behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son." So the 2 of them walked on together. See, this wasn't unusual in most respects for Isaac. The elements are familiar to him. A journey, wood, fire, knife, sacrifice. This all makes sense to him. I know what that is. I know what that is. I know what that does. Something's missing, Dad. Sacrifice must have been central to their worship. They know why sacrifice is necessary. But something's missing. God himself will provide a lamb. Verse 9. Then they came to the place which God had told them. And Abraham built the altar there, arranged the wood, bound his son Isaac, and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. You can see it. It's one of the most visually arresting pictures in all the Bible. And you just immediately, how could Abraham trust God like this? How could Abraham stretch out the knife to slay his son as a sacrifice? Again, without getting too graphic, there's a painting in the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art in Kansas City, which is where I went to college. And so that's why I know that there's a painting there, because I had to write a paper on this painting, so I stared at it for hours. And it's a painting of this moment. And Isaac is on the altar, and I'll do it with my left hand. Abraham has the knife like way up here, ready to plunge it into his son. Okay, again, without getting too graphic, if it's a sacrifice, that's not how it happened. And some of you know exactly what it would be to sacrifice an animal. So it's intensely personal. This is gruesome. This is horrifying. This is unthinkable. Quick, get me to Jesus. You know, that's what we do. Especially because we know the end of the story. Quick, get me to Jesus. Get me to the good news. Remind me that God stopped Abraham to let Jesus die. Get past the dread of this moment where the knife is stretched out. Move on to the happy ending. Just get me to Jesus, right? That's where we are, right? But I want you to hold right there. I want you to stay right there. Leave the threat in place. Why was sacrifice necessary? If you think about the big picture arc that I've told you about before, when you look at the story of God over all of eternity, there's 4 parts to it. I usually use 6, but we'll make it simple, 4. And in every individual story, there's some piece of this, right? So there's creation, fall, redemption, recreation. So what is this story telling us? Fall. See, if we jump to Jesus, we immediately say, well, it's about redemption. It's about Jesus. It's about Him. You first got to talk about the fall. Why was sacrifice necessary? Anybody have an idea? Why was sacrifice necessary?
Eden.
What?
Eden.
Evil.
It's not what it said, but yes.
Oh, I thought, what'd you say?
I said Eden.
Eden.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sacrifice was necessary because of the fall, because of sin, because of evil. Which is what she said. Sacrifice is at the center of most of the world's worship. All religions sacrifice. Sacrifices are always a substitute for what is actually owed. That's what's going on here. In almost all of the world, there's an understanding among those religions we owe our lives to God, but since that isn't possible, we sacrifice something of value instead. And the more valuable the substitute, the greater the sense of that debt being paid. The greater the comfort of that debt being paid. Temporarily at least. I mean, does that make sense? The more valuable the substitute, the greater the sense of that debt being paid. So that's why even in the Old Testament system of sacrifice, when the Old Testament laws are put into place, the rich people had to sacrifice a bull because that was very valuable to them. Poor people could sacrifice a bird because that was the most valuable thing they had or could get. The value of the sacrifice had to be in line with the value of the debt owed. If I understand my sin, I can't just go sacrifice, I don't know, a bug. If I understand the depth of my sin, I can't just go sacrifice a mouse. If I understand the depth of my sin, I can't just sacrifice anything. It has to be something of worth and value. That's why it's so important that we sit in the uncomfortableness of this story. Before rushing ahead to, but Jesus died for me, etc., etc., until Jesus, this is the best biblical picture for the cost and debt of our sin. See, the question that naturally comes out of this story is, do I have this kind of faith? Could I ever do this? And thankfully, we don't have to. We don't have to think about it. God made that clear. But if we don't wrestle with our own sin, we will make our own substitution. Stop me if you've heard this. What is your Isaac? Yeah, I don't know either. What is it that you don't want to give to God? What haven't you surrendered? I actually have heard this story taught in order to, I've heard this story covered in order to teach tithing. Tithing is powerful, it's important. I get that. This ain't about tithing. This isn't about your Isaac. This isn't about you giving up this one thing that you want to surrender to God. It's not. By minimizing the reason for the sacrifice, we minimize the sacrifice. I'm going to come back to what we've been talking about. Does it bother you? The image. Abraham, altar. Isaac, bound. Knife, about to kill him. Sacrifice him, about to burn him. Does that disturb you? It's supposed to. It should. It's a picture of our sin. It's a picture of what is necessary. So as I've spent time here in this story, I got to thinking, why am I not just as horrified over my own sin and separation? This sacrifice is unthinkable. It's reprehensible, but so is my sin. So is my separation from God. And so then I began thinking, but my sin isn't that bad. Right? Like, I've never killed anybody. I started doing all these justification things. I started doing the give me the Jesus thing in my own mind. And then I felt like God asked me this question. So, if that's true, if my own stuff isn't that bad, if This almost sacrifice that almost happened is that awful and that reprehensible and that horrible, but I'm okay, I'm pretty good compared to that, then why did that almost sacrifice get stopped and a ram was substituted, but the sacrifice necessary for my sin actually happened and it involved a totally innocent, pure, holy man dying? The reason we don't want to get past all this ugly, the reason we want to get past all this ugly is we don't want to be reminded of and confronted by our sin. So in order to get to the good news, to get to Jesus, don't ever forget, don't ever minimize or downplay His sacrifice. Don't ever minimize, don't ever downplay our debt and His payment. So let's finish this out with the good news. This sacrifice wins. Verse 11. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. Man, that's the first time that he really just, boy, I'll bet that came out fast. He said, do not stretch out your hand against the boy. Do nothing to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in the thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. Abraham called the name of that place, I did good. Abraham called the name of that place, I obeyed. That's not what it says. Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, in the mount of the Lord it will be provided. By the way, scholars believe that the site of that near sacrifice is the exact site of the cross. Mount Moriah existed probably, again, you'll find differences of opinion, but Mount Moriah existed probably outside of Jerusalem, exactly where Mount Calvary actually is. But the place was named, the Lord will provide, not Abraham obeys. God's commitment to us is being demonstrated far more significantly and strongly than Abraham's obedience. It's not just about Abraham's commitment to God, it's about God's commitment to Abraham. So this is not primarily about how well you obey. Could you do what Abraham did? No. I couldn't. This is about how perfectly Jesus obeyed. If you are anyone in this story, you and I are Isaac. Because we get set free while a substitute is sacrificed in our place. God has not withheld His Son, His only Son. And therefore, we can give anything. We can turn loose of anything. See, I'm going to say it again. If we don't go through the process that we just did, and again, that kind of starts with who is God? What has He done? If we start with what do I do, we will immediately begin to offer sacrifices that are far less than what God actually asks for. If you jump to what do I do? Then you begin to ask the question, well, what is my Isaac? And so then we put into place things like, well, my Isaac is, I gossip a lot. Or my Isaac is, I do this. Or my Isaac, that's not it. We inevitably come up with something less than what God actually wants. There's an old hymn, I guess Chris Tomlin updated it so people know it again. But listen to the first and last verses. When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my richest gain I count loss, and I pour contempt on all my pride. Were the whole realm of nature mine, that were at present far too small. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my life, my soul, my all. You have a substitute who gave all because you can't. And because you have a substitute who gave all because you can't, you give all. Intentionally, imperfect, inconsistent, but for years, you give all. Which, yes, means that whatever it is that God puts in your mind, that's what He wants you to give today. But it doesn't mean that you stop there. You give all. There is no sum in this story at all. If anything, we are Isaac. We have a substitute who gave his life so we could be free. In response to that salvation, to a God who would save us when we are hopeless, a God who would give us everything, He deserves our surrender back to Him. This is not a story about whether or not I will sacrifice my Isaac. It's a story about the sacrifice of Jesus, yes. It's not a story about what I am willing to sacrifice. It's a story about what He already sacrificed. And therefore, in gratitude of that, I give Him everything. That includes Isaac's. I give Him everything. So let me read this to you from a couple of different places in Scripture, and we'll close. This is the Message translation of Romans 12. Romans 12 talks about being a living sacrifice. And it says this. So here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for Him. And then the other one is in the Old Testament. It directly relates to sacrifice. It's Deanna's grandfather's favorite passage. Just listen. We'll pray. With what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Should I come before Him with burnt offerings? Should I come before Him with calves a year old? Would the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Should I offer my firstborn for my sin? Should I offer the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has shown you what is good. He has already shown you what the Lord requires of you. Act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. And God, I just thank you for the emotional description that you provide this story with. I thank you that it disturbs us. I thank you that it is unsettling. I thank you that it tears at my heart to think about, literally, think about this with my own kids, my own son. I thank you that it just tears at us. And God, I just ask that our own sin and our own separation would tear at us in the same way. I am far, far too flippant, too nonchalant, too easy with my own sin and separation from you. And again, I thank you that the sacrifice of Jesus that we do get to in this story, I thank you that that sacrifice, His forgiveness, covers even the fact that we don't respond to you with the depth at which we should respond to you. Sacrifice, the gospel, the good news covers the fact that I am not as repentant and not as sorry as I need to be. It covers the fact that I am not as celebratory and gracious and full of gratitude as I should be. It's amazing, just as amazing. So as we sit in both of those things, I just ask that we would begin to see that our only natural response is you get everything. You get absolutely everything. And it's going to come piecemeal. It's going to come piece at a time. But you get everything. Help us to give ourselves to you in that way. Pray that in Jesus' name. If you have never given yourself to Jesus in that way for the first time, I don't often do official invitations here, but I'm going to do it today. But I'm not going to have you raise your hands or come down front or whatever. Just find one of the leaders of the church. Just talk to us. By Holy Spirit's power, you can understand these things. If you're being drawn, if you're even thinking about these things for the first time, understand that is God's work in you. It's not you being curious. It's not you kind of, hey, wonder what this is. No, that's God calling you. And I just implore you not to ignore that.